And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage. And you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. My guest is Kristi Faulkner. Kristi is an old friend and the president of Womenkind. She is a frequent contributor to many different well-known mediums. She's in the process of writing a book. She does a fair amount of speaking. She's primarily a business owner in the media space and the ad space, but has done a really good and thoughtful job of using content to get the message out and to help drive her business. So thanks for joining us, Kristi.
Absolutely.
So you're a creative director and you've got a cool ad agency. So why don't you tell us first what Womenkind is? Because that's a cool company.
Yeah, so we are the first and only comprehensive strategic marketing company that focuses on women. We're run by women and we market to women who are, as you know, the world's most powerful consumer.
Especially in my house, but
Yes,
but across the world as well.
in every house.
In every house. So yeah. So you have decided, and you come from the big Madison Avenue world, and then you've broken on your own with your partner. And one of the ways that, sort of the David and Goliath piece of how do you compete against these big, massive budgeted ad agencies is being smart and thoughtful and using thought leadership. And you've done a lot of that over the years. So can you talk a little bit about how you develop and deploy content to sort of differentiate yourself in the marketplace?
Yeah, so there's a double-edged sword of being a woman, especially in marketing and advertising, and that is there aren't very many of us. So when a woman's voice is needed, there aren't a lot of us to go to. So that certainly gives me a platform, and certainly the company, being women marketing to women and focused on women, gives me a unique positioning. And I think
So
positioning
that's
is
a
something.
positive though, right? Because it's not like if I was looking for marketers at the Fortune 1000 or something, they're a dime a dozen. So you've got a niche there.
Right. So there's a niche, and I just like in brand marketing, I think positioning is really important. So it helps. We say that we're not experts; we're just women who study women. You don't have to be a woman to be expert on women. So, but we do a lot of market research, a lot of data collection, and we just keep our finger on the pulse of this category, which is really not just women as consumers, but women as investors, women as employees. I mean, we really do look at all aspects of a woman's life, and it's a very fertile ground for content and ideas and perspective.
Got it. So give me an example of content that you've put out there that's sort of aligned with the vision and the purpose of the firm, and how you use that to attract those that are important to you, potentially new clients or differentiate in a bake off or something.
Well, for one thing, as you mentioned, I do a lot of speaking, but it's really mostly important. The most important thing we do is create the content, and by the content, I mean the insights and the ideas, because a lot of the data that we leverage is out there. Anybody could find it. We don't. All of our data isn't proprietary, but yet our perspective is proprietary, and certainly our insights. And because we're a creative and very strategic agency, we have a method where we can put one and one together to create 11. That's just that's the creative approach, right? So we look at a lot of data that exists and put it through our own filters, and then come up with various points of view. So then, either I speak on these topics, I write for Women at Forbes, which is a wonderful platform because a lot of people see it. But my challenge really is it's like boiling the ocean, right? It's like trying to distill so much. There's just so much incredible.
So I want to unpack 2 points that you made. So number one, a lot of times when you're dealing with smaller organizations like yours, like most of ours, right? The thought is, oh man, it's going to take so many resources to get proprietary data. I love that you're using data that everybody else has access to, but it's really the perspective and your take and your interpretation of it that's the differentiator, as
Right.
opposed to cutting and pasting just data that anybody could do. So that, because there's no cost to that other than your thoughtfulness, right? So you don't have to go build an index or something. The second piece, when you talk about speaking, how do you determine, this would be a great place for me to speak, and maybe this one not so much? And oftentimes I think people early in their thought leadership journey say yes to too many things, and then they realize like, yeah, that maybe not.
Yeah, I am guilty of that as well because ideal euphoric person, and I always and as we were talking about, I look at data and I see connections that maybe somebody else with a different acumen wouldn't see, and so I often see connections and invitations that maybe someone else doesn't see, and sometimes they play out and sometimes they don't. So I wish I had more discipline, and I do try to be more disciplined now about things that I accept. But for instance, I love creativity. So I've been invited to speak on creativity a couple of times. Well, that's not really about women, and it's not really, I mean, it is, creativity is involved in everything, but it's not really about my company.
Sure.
But I just have a real passion for creative synthesis, and so whenever I get invited to speak on something like that, I tend to sort of jump on it. I'm speaking next month at the Direct to Consumer Wine Symposium, which is happening out in California. And I'm really excited about that because the wine and spirits industry has not been kind to
Right.
women as it has been to men. And so I'd like to trailblaze a little bit. So yes, like my sweet spot would be, speaking at to a group of CMOs who have, consumer brands. That would be a sweet spot. Those opportunities don't come up every day, though. So that's all I'm saying.
What I was going to say, there's two pieces to the puzzle, right? There's the content, right? So if your core messaging is around marketing to women more effectively, or being that's your expertise, that's number one. When somebody talks to you and says, hey, Kristi, come talk about creativity, that's a passion of yours. So that is different. So there's nothing wrong with doing it, but it's outside of your scope. Not outside of your scope, but outside of sort of the domain expertise that the brand represents per se.
Right.
It's sort of underlying. But the second piece that you mentioned that's interesting is the audience, right? So an audience of CMO is awesome, trailblazing. I love the wine and spirits industry from the perspective of, I don't know what the female version of Joe Sixpack is, right? But they sort of forgot women. Most women I know drink. They're missing an opportunity there.
Absolutely. And so, like with really thought leadership is, in my view, it's basically, self marketing, right? So you're marketing your own personal brand. I really don't like the term personal branding, but it's essentially what you're doing. So in any brand exercise, you want to figure out what makes your brand unique and different and how you stand out. And then you want to make sure you're communicating to the right audience. I mean, we say right woman, right message, right place is, our kind of mantra. And I think it's the same thing when you think about any kind of content you create. Is who are you speaking to? What is your message? And where are you reaching them? Because people are more receptive to certain ideas and thoughts and content in different places.
Exactly.
So for instance, the way I write is not exactly the way I speak. I write more, the written content is much more fact based, and it has some opinions certainly, but it's validated and meant to be supported. Whereas when I speak, even if it's to the same type of audience that I might be writing for through Forbes, if I speak, it's a much more dynamic, much more opinion. It's much more about me and my personality and my ideas, which are somewhat qualitative versus quantitative.
Well, there's a style piece, right? So you can use a different voice on on a speaking platform that if you did a transcript of that and put it in an article, it might seem cheeky or something, it might seem out of context. But
Right.
I think that's right. I think it's knowing sort of the right tone, and usually can have more fun in a speaking environment than than you could in a writing environment.
Well, and you need to, right? Because you're engaging so many more of the five senses in the audience than when you're just reading. Reading is quiet, it's cerebral. It needs to hold attention in a much different way than speaking does.
And actually, I just recalled you and I actually met. We were both on a panel. So I mean, there's another benefit to being at events and speaking is you meet I don't necessarily like-minded people, but interesting people that have a perspective and such.
Well, so what's interesting, I really enjoy being on panels. But what's
Yeah,
interesting to me about the difference between being on a panel and speaking is you have to intently listen when you're on a panel, and that's obviously it's a very different skill when I'm speaking, even if it's just a 20-minute keynote or whatever. It's short. I'm focused on me basically
Yep.
for 20 minutes. What I'm thinking, what I'm saying, how I'm saying it, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're on a panel, it's much more it should be, I think, much more natural. It's a dialogue, and you really have to intently listen to where the conversation is going so you can contribute something meaningful to it as opposed to being the one and only speaker. So I
Well, you don't control that flow, right? You know that here's the points I'm going to make and the sequence, and I usually use this sort of story or whatever, but it's much more of an improv type experience.
Right. And I find that I find it very active, in the sense of when I go to give a talk, or even when I sit down to write an article, when I'm lucky, I know what I'm going to say.
You hope.
Yeah, like I always say, good ideas write themselves. The problem is getting a good idea. But when you're on a panel, like you said, it's improv. You have no idea what you're going to say. You just sort of
Right.
you have to be really in tune and really listening. But again, you have to think about that third person. So regardless of how many people are on the panel, I don't mean to say that. What I mean to say is there's a person you're listening to, and then there's the audience who's listening to you both. So it's really panels are much more multi-tiered communication,
Exactly.
in the sense that you don't want to start boring the audience because you're taking the conversation in a direction that's not interesting to them. So even though you've got to actively listen to the other panelists that you are going to respond to, you have to think about, well, what does the audience want to hear? What do they want to get from eavesdropping on our dialogue, so to
Yeah.
speak.
And not get caught up in the other person. So let me ask you this. So lots of different activities, and you've made a lot of investments in content and thought leadership and development. Could you give an example or speak through how it's really helped the business? Because I work with a lot of folks that are in similar places of view in terms of they're the founder or the leader of a business. They have a perspective. It might be a little different, might be a little contrarian, might be a little bit on the edge, and they're using the content to attract a certain type of like-minded client or someone that'll lean in. How has that played out for you successfully?
The nature of my business is I sell ideas, right? I mean, that is what I do. A brand, an organization, a marketer will come to us essentially to tap into our strategic thinking. So I really have to think about what kind of ideas I want to put out there in my content in terms of, again, that audience, but what kind of audience do I want to attract? What kind of clients do I want to attract? And because I'm only successful when I'm selling ideas. So if someone doesn't like my ideas, then they're not going to enjoy working with us, and they're certainly not going to, we're not going
Well,
to
and
have a
vice versa, probably, right? You don't
right.
want a combative
Oh,
relationship with a client.
absolutely, absolutely. So in a way, the content, it's almost like a Match.com profile in a sense. That you really have to think about the kind of client you want to attract, with the ideas that you're putting out there. Because I really, in my kind of business, I really need to feel some sort of connection with my client.
I think it's an amazing point because I think sometimes in the business development side of the world, we want to attract everyone. And I think the smart thing is to say, listen, do you really want to fight so hard up front to convert someone that your way of thinking or operating or whatever the case may be is a better way versus getting folks to lean in conceptually to what you're about and what you're thinking, etc. And I think the latter is a better approach. So if you're out there speaking and you, I don't say piss off, but but there's 20% of the audience that goes, no, I don't believe in what she says and I would do it the old school way and blah, blah, blah. That's good for you and good for them actually, because you're not wasting your time on proposal cycles and all that. If they're not digging what you're saying, then great, that's cool. But those that do come up to you after, whether it's speaking or writing or whatever, there's already some sort of a connection or an alignment in terms of the mindset and the thinking. Would you agree?
Absolutely. So, and I'm glad. I'm glad when somebody disagrees
Yeah.
with me. Just disagrees with Look, we're always going to have productive disagreements in a creative process. However, when somebody fundamentally disagrees with my position, so to speak, then that's great because you know what? It narrows down my audience, and I think I think a narrower target is actually more beneficial. The narrower you are, the more of an expert that you are. I think that's better.
And you can go much deeper. The narrower you are, by definition, you can go much deeper in terms of the gravitas and the depth and the expertise that you bring to the table.
Right. And so my ideal client actually, it's not someone who knows women as well as I do. That's a perfectly excellent client. I certainly would never turn that away. But my true ideal client is the marketer or the brand who says we're not doing as well by women as we should be, and we need to figure this out. Because I feel like I have a lot to offer somebody to help them, embark on that journey to figure out women and educate them and bring them along. So I don't want the type of relationship with the client who doesn't value women, and I don't want the type of client that necessarily celebrates women. I'm just saying those are the two extremes, those who ignore and those who completely indulge. I think that sweet spot is in the middle there.
It's also nice when someone approaches you and says, "Hey, I've seen you speak twice, and I've read a bunch of your articles on Forbes." At that point, they know what you're about, right? So you set the table nicely in a very efficient way, and they're sort of raising their hand and saying, "I think we're on the same page here. Let's talk about my specific needs, but I know your philosophy and sort of your take on it, or at least at a cursory level."
Right. So I feel like the best content that I can put out there is something that starts a conversation.
I love it.
I don't necessarily want to have all the answers. I never look, when I begin to work with a client, I know zero about their business. And, a month later, I'm an expert. Like that's just the way we work. We learn everything we can about a potential client, their issues, their problems, their goals, objectives, all of that stuff. So I don't ever want to profess. Well, I certainly have certain expertise, but in terms of creating content, I never want to profess that we have the be all end all answers. I only want to begin the conversation. Just stimulate, be provocative, have some questions that begin a dialogue and ignite ideas. So when I think about creating content, I always think it doesn't have to have the answers, it just has to stimulate the right questions.
No, that's fantastic insight. Well, I want to thank you for your time. There's so much that you sort of put on the table today in terms of what you're saying and how you're saying and the different formats and using data that's in the public domain, but giving an interpretation of it. I think there's a lot of really valid information here. And, you're a case in point that you can use content and thought leadership and speaking and writing, et cetera, effectively to develop your brand and more importantly, to build your business. So thank you for sharing all that with us today. Thanks so much, Kristi.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.